All right. Welcome to the people in the room and welcome to our friends on Zoom. We have a new camera back there. You can wave to the people, that thing over there. Yes. They have a nice wide angle view of the room. I'm reading a book about Charles Darwin and Abraham Lincoln. I think you might have told me to read it. It's a common story in my life. It's called Angels and Ages, Lincoln, Darwin, and the Birth of the Modern Age. And this is one sentence from this book. It's by Adam Gopnik. He writes for the New Yorker a lot. He wrote, above all, the origin, that's Darwin's work, the origin of the species is a long argument meant for amateur readers, an effort at popular persuasion. It's so well written that we don't think of it as well written. Just as Lincoln's speeches are so well made that they seem to us as natural as pebbles on the beach. We don't think well said, we just think that's right. We don't think well said, we just think that's right. My experience of learning with Rabbi Hoffman has always been one of that's right. And it started in ritual studies, a class that I now look at as the foundation to everything else that I learned in rabbinical school. Rabbi Hoffman began by passing around a sheet that said modernity is. And he went down and he has all these quotes, and I just kept thinking to myself, that's right. Which is to say, Rabbi Hoffman didn't mess us with this of language, syntax, or style of presentation, although he had fine control over all of that. Capital T, truth into the room. And all his students agreed. Well said, yes, but more so, that's right. That's right. So that's what you've given me and all of us as well. So thank you for being here this weekend with us. It's been tremendous.
Oh my goodness. I got a mic on here. You all hear me? This mic is working now, right? Yes? And it's working on the Zoom screen? All right, so I'm going to sit down briefly, though I don't sit very well or very long, but I feel like we can have a conversation, you know. It's nice. I'm in the living room, and we're sitting in someone's living room, your own possibly, and we're not a lecture, even though I will, of course, have things to say, but it's, you know, just us chickens sitting here. I'm grateful to Josh. First of all, I'm grateful to all the rabbis who have introduced me. I only wish I had another talk so I can get another introduction. It was very nice. I mean, I'll go home with a lot of yeast in this dough. We shall have to fight now come Yom Kippur. I want to say thank you, Josh, about that's right. I have only one caveat. I wish you had said that to my kids when they were little. They somehow never realized that, you know. They never said, oh, my father's talking. That's right. Never happened. So where are we in our conversation? What have we accomplished? What have you learned? What have you thought about? What sticks with you? A good society. Thank you.
And goodness and what makes a good person, and the role of God in all of that.
Right, the changing thinking about what it makes for a good person, and the role of God in all that, what I called the different pieties. Let's run through them. The first one's the piety of plenty in the Bible, the farmer's piety. Then came piety of penitence, that's right, which was most of Jewish history until reform in the 19th century and the Enlightenment. And then they began feeling their oats in the world. They became, you know, they had citizenship and so on. And so they developed the piety of didn't deal with something not you, and it was late at night by the time I got to it. Yes, piety of human potential. That's exactly right. I wanted to just say potential because it was a nice P word with piety and penitence, but piety of human potential. The notion that we can do anything. Hey, look what we can, which was the 19th century for sure. And then came the 20th century, and we discovered some of the things we did were not what we wanted to have done. And there were limits to the process that we could expect in our own time. We weren't going to bring the Messiah, as it were. And so what I'm arguing for now is a modification of piety of human potential, and I called it the piety of higher purpose. That's right. And I remember saying, I reviewed it with some people this morning at our table, or one table or another where I was sitting. There are not a lot of people today who we really want to meet. My son asked me that the other day. He said, who would you like to meet in the world? And I couldn't think of too many people. He said, come on, all the people who changed the world, who would you really like to meet? Because they recognize kind of human nobility and dignity and all that you want to strive for. And I thought, boy, are we in bad shape? You know, I mean, all over the world, really. I could think of a couple of people maybe, but it was really hard. So it means that we'll have to start on our own. In our world, we can become people of higher purpose. And I think that's the purpose of Yom Kippur, where we stand now. Well, tonight, this afternoon, yes, you need they're going to make you talk into a microphone.
First of all, I know this is not fair that I'm asking you two questions because I could ask you these privately. The relationship between sin and evil, I think at some point this morning, I feel like the use of one term drifted into another, and I'm just interested in that. And I thought a lot since we met. If you have a system like we live, I'll say I live in a scientific system, and the scientific system has an explanation for why we die. Our physical engine simply runs out. And if you live in a religious system, the religious system has God beginning as the source of life. Then it seems to me sin is not an unreasonable explanation for the source of death. In other words, God's gift isn't infinite. They know that everybody dies, so they have to come up with an explanation for it. And sin seems to me to be a pretty good explanation for eventually, because they know that everybody sins, and so eventually
Everybody dies.
Because eventually, yes.
You know, we talk every week or every other week. This is like par for the course. You know, I can tell you there are a few better things to do in a week than have an hour conversation with Rabbi Zemmel here. We ask each other these questions all the time and argue about them, think about them, and discuss. Someone at this table someone's asked me why I don't use the word evil or sin. And I hedged for a bit because the immediate response didn't come to me, though I knew there was one. And I said in part because that's a traditional word and I find it useful. I also think that I like the idea of a verb, to sin. There isn't the verb to evil. We have to say to do evil, make evil, create evil. I mean, I don't know, you know. And I think there's something about a verb that makes us more responsible for our actions. So when I say I have sinned, this sounds a lot worse than I have done evil, in a way. Now, maybe not, but I just like the idea of focusing on the perpetrator of it. But I also think sin, precisely what bothers us about sin, is that it's such a heavily religiously laden word. And so, I don't sin. But actually, what if we do? I mean, precisely because it has that power, like to use it. Now, I would reserve it for what's really beyond the pale evil. There's certain things that are just so awful, they call out for a new word. I'm thinking of rape, I'm thinking of murder, I'm thinking of all the things that you're fighting in your congregation, because you know what's going on in our country. This is evil. Violence, you know, this is evil. And to be able to say to someone, you have sinned, it takes them back. I mean, and I like the idea of the power of it. So I prefer to use the word precisely because of the religious power of it. I know it is overused, and I know we live in a world where every evangelical preacher in the world is talking about it, so it loses its cachet. But you know, language can be inflated, so it doesn't mean anything anymore. But since we never use it here in the liberal community, I want to re-embrace it as a way of saying this is beyond even anything I can imagine. And if someone has done sin, and that has sinned, oh my God, you know. So I'd like to kind of keep the word, and so in my mind anyway, I've reestablished it. As for why we die, of course we die for the scientific reason. But in a religious system, you say, well, then it would seem that sin is a good explanation. It is and it isn't. The problem is that when we die doesn't correspond to sin, because little babies die. Now, if you believe babies are born into original sin, as many Christians do, then it even works for babies. And in fact, once you decide that we die because of sin, then you kind of have to say that babies sin even though they haven't done anything. They're born with it. But anyone who's lost anyone they love, and it's not to a ripe old age, it's pretty hard to say, well, I can see that you were a sinner, so you lost 20 years, you know, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. So I don't think it works very well unless you adopt the idea of original sin. Last comment, and then we'll move on. I don't. But religious minds.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
why do
Well, so Danny is saying that essentially, if you're religious and you're looking for an answer and you don't want to accept just a scientific answer, it's reasonable for people who already know about sin and believe in it to adopt it as a reason. And I say it's not so reasonable. Once they adopt it, they're stuck with the fact that lots of people die before their time and couldn't possibly have done evil because they're only 7 days old or something. And so then they have to adopt the notion of somehow original sin that we've inherited. So even though you haven't actually done anything, you're responsible because you're related to Adam. So that's just the way it is. And of course, I don't want to go that far, and so I don't even want to use sin as a reason for. I don't think God works that way, but that's another story. Okay, so today we're going to look at the epitome of the piety of penance. Now, I've actually talked about this prayer in your congregation before. I came here many years ago, not BC, but maybe PC, which, pre-COVID. And I give a talk at Slichot, and I mentioned it. So some of you may remember it because you're such wonderful people. You remember everything I say because if I say it, it's right after all. But I want to go into it in depth today. So some of you will remember bits and pieces of it. And I say, bravo, that's wonderful. Oh boy. Some of you weren't there, of course, and won't remember anything. Some of you weren't there and I still think you remember it. But I don't know how that works. But in any case, we're going to go in some detail and you'll find it fascinating. We're talking about Unakanatoka. How many people know what that prayer is? Does it ring a bell, the name at all? Some of you will, yeah? The part that will ring a bell is it says, who shall live and who shall die? Remember that prayer that kind of in the afternoon, of the late morning of Yom Kippur, and you're settling into Yom Kippur, all of a sudden you read, on this day it's established. Who's going to live and who's going to die? And you think, oh my God, is that serious? And then you wonder, and here's the problem. You wonder, so-and-so died last year. Was that determined? I mean, Do we get told if we're determined or something? There are all kinds of problems with it. And so here's a prayer that most people, I think, can't believe at all. And yet we say it. Partly it's because it's got a great chant. People, the song, there are several settings for it, great music. But partly because it's an incredibly important prayer. It took over the service. Sometimes you add a paragraph to your essay, and the paragraph is so good, that's the only thing anybody remembers, but it's such a great paragraph, it kind of colonized the rest of the talk, the rest of the essay. So here's a case where a prayer has colonized the entire service. And if you don't do it, people miss it, even if they don't like it. So we're going to look at it and find out how it got started, and we'll talk about the prayer in some detail. Here's what I want to do. As we read it together, I got a translator here. I want you to, as we go through the lines, if there's something you really like, I don't mean that's nice. I mean, you really like it, you put a thumb up. Got it? If there's something that you really hate, thumbs down. We need a thumb counter. So since Josh, you've been kind enough to share all of this, here's what you're going to do if you don't mind. I want you to watch the thumbs, because I can't watch all the thumbs. And if you see more than 50% of the thumbs go up, then you say, wait a minute, this is worth stopping at. And if you see more than 50% of the thumbs going down, then they'll look at that. So this is we're taking the temperature of the piece, okay? Up or down. We will not change the prayer book based on your thumbs, but you get a vote. Okay, here we go. Oh, I forgot to tell you what this is altogether. This is a prayer that originally was a poem. Now, have you ever been to a traditional service on Yom Kippur? How many people have? You know, like an Orthodox shul, even a conservative synagogue? Do you remember how you get to Yom Kippur and it sort of doesn't matter when you arrive? Because it's going to be forever anyway. And also, they tell you the page number, but every page looks sort of the same. And you're lost, even if you know Shema and the basic stuff, right? And then you look and you say, well, it's only 400 pages to go, right? And so you count pages. And you know it's all day. What are you going to do? The reason for that is that they began writing poems all the way back in the 4th and 5th century, which they inserted into the particularly the Amidah, but other places too. So particularly in the Amidah, because that's the most important prayer for Jews, you stand in front of God and you talk to God, they wrote poems. Now these poems were so numerous that they colonized the service. And so there's more poetry than there is stuff that the poetry's put into. And you know you're reading these poems generally because you can't pronounce the Hebrew. Even Israelis who really speak Hebrew rather well. Even they can't pronounce it. They get stuck on it because they often choose words that are rarely ever used, and they make up words, for goodness sake. And so what you have is poets who didn't have a very large vocabulary in Hebrew because in the Middle Ages, Hebrew hadn't developed. And so they just made up words if they needed to. Plus, they used to use acrostics. It became impossible to understand. And nowadays, the only way you understand these poems usually is that there's an apparatus at the bottom of the page where people tell you what it means, because everything stands for something else. Now, that's not always the case, but ideally, these poets strived for that. At any rate, we're looking at one of those poems. Now, one of the poem put in the Amidah was called a karova, from the word karev, to draw near, because it was an offering to God. You drew near to God, as it were, and you offer God this gift of a poem. And these poems were 9 paragraphs long. They were squeezed into the first 3 blessings of the Amidah. Amidah has like a lot of blessings in it, but these are the first 3. And the climactic one was in the 3rd blessing, which is Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. So you have a whole bunch of poems squeezed into the first couple pages of the Amidah. And the climactic one, if you stay there long enough, is the last part. And it is called, this term we're going to use in a moment, this is called a siluk. Siluk means to go up. And it's like, I'm offering this to you. When you get to the last paragraph, it rises to God. And now you're offering the sacrifice of your lips, as it were, to God. So it's called a siluk. Because it's what just before you offer it, then it's followed by kadosh, kadosh, kadosh. These are the angels. You're being the angels. That's part of the plot that's going on in the background. And so the first line of it is, look at line 4 on page 16. Holiness, rise up to you, for you are our God King. That's the traditional beginning. When you see that, say, oh, here's a siluk. I can just tell. All right. So we are reading one of these siluks, one of the 9th part of a large poem that's an offering to God. Here we go. Prepare your thumbs. Let us acknowledge the power of this day's holiness, for it is full of awe and dread. On it, your kingdom will be exalted and your throne will be established in love. Couple of thumbs, but not hot yet. All right. And you will reign from it in truth. Truly, you are judge, prosecutor, litigant, and witness, writer of the verdict and its sealer, recorder and recounter. Do we have any judges in this room? Do we have any? We have lawyers in the room. This is not what you call a fair trial, right? There's a word for it. We call it a kangaroo court. Unless you're in Australia, they have another word for it. It's, something, I don't know what they would call it anyway. So you look at that. Did I see any thumbs going down? I would hope. You like the idea of a trial? You want to stand trial where God does it all? I mean, my goodness. Well, all right. Some of you like it. Good for you. There you go. That's the way to put it. Okay. Well, and that's what it says next, right? You remember everything that has been forgotten. That is to say, you can't hide anything from me. You open the book of memories. It will be read. Everyone's signature is in it. A better translation might be, your fingerprints are all over it. Or, this is a signed confession. So you walk into the trial with your deeds, and you've already signed the confession. So you know what's going to happen. Now a great shofar is sounded, and a thin whisper of sound will be heard. Thin whisper of sound is a translation of what we usually say a still small voice, called mama daka. It occurs in the story of Elijah, where Elijah is escaping from where he's going to be killed by the king and the queen, the evil king and queen in the Bible. And he's depressed as all get out. And he can't believe how awful things are. He's about to die. And God speaks to him. But God, there's thunder and lightning, and God doesn't show up in that. And amazingly, God is in a still, small voice. More likely, a thin whisper of sound is a nice translation, I think. Now look at that. It's a great shofar. You got a big shofar here in the congregation, that goes curls around, go, woo! But this is that's pretty good, don't you think? This is actually, I do it better without the shofar. This is actually a big shofar, and you blow it for all it's worth, and what comes out is a whisper of sound. But if you know the Bible, you know that's a sign that God is here. So this is a trial, and it's announced by this great shofar. And because a thin whisper of sound comes out, you know this is God. The judge is entering. Not all rise, just in small voice, a thin whisper of sound. So the result, of course, angels will recoil and be gripped by shaking and trembling. This is the day in court, they say, for passing judgment on the hosts on high. Them, even angels get judged on that day, not just human beings. They will not pass muster as innocent when you judge them. Even the angels are apparently sinners, it seems. All who enter the world must pass before you like sheep Alternatively, translation of manuscripts, it's really like soldiers on review. You've seen soldiers on review, you know, where the colonel or something passes by the troops and they all have to pass muster. So that's the image. It comes out of the Roman Empire. Okay? As now we get the shepherd, however. As a shepherd searches for his flock and has his sheep pass under his staff, so too will you record and recount and review all living beings as you have them pass by. You will decide the end of all creatures, writing down their sentences. Oh, you got up? Yeah. How many are up? Put your hand up high if you're not. How many people are no, down? The downs have it. All right. Yeah, but I see rabbis have their hands up. It's like we did something to you in rabbinic school, so you only get to say, I like this text, I guess. Yeah, okay, here we go. It's beautiful poetry. That it is. All right. We'll move right along. Okay, here we go. On Rosh Hashanah, it will be written, and on Yom Kippur, it will be sealed. How many will pass on? How many will be created? How will live and who will die? Who at their proper end and who not? Who by water and who by fire? Who by warfare? Who by wildlife? Who by hunger? Who by thirst? Who by earthquake? Who by plague? Who by strangling? Who by stoning? Who will rest and who will wander? Who will be tranquil and who will be troubled? Who will be calm and who will be tormented? Who will be exalted and who will be humbled? Who will be rich and who will be poor? Do I see thumbs? You like that? You want to go to rabbinic school? Ah.
When Leonard Cohen died, and the New York Times wrote a big obituary of him, and it was written by a rock critic, and he quoted the Leonard Cohen song that contains these lines.
Yeah.
And he praised Leonard Cohen for this wonderful poetry. And I thought to myself, you know, really biblical literacy, sort of, you know, or religious literacy in our country is just no understanding at all in the Times piece that this had some liturgical. Yeah.
So do you think this is, when you like it as poetry?
I like it as poetry.
you like
This
it as
also
truth?
always moves me on Yom Kippur because of the mystery that we all face of how will we go?
Yes.
And when will we go?
Yeah.
And
Do I see more hands going up?
is it comfort to think that God knows that
Yeah.
in advance? I don't really know.
Okay, let's take a couple more goes at this. You need to wait for the microphone. Who will get the mic and who will not? Decide again.
When you were asking for thumbs up or thumbs down, were you asking for thumbs up and thumbs down for well said or that's right?
That is the question, exactly. The answer is yes. Either way, apparently, because I'm saying, I actually thought in terms of content, you like the idea, but I can see that you're way ahead of me and some of you already figured out from the idea, but you like the poetry, or it's symbolic, or it means more than it seems to imply. We'll get there. Okay. Yeah.
I want to, I like it as cosmology, not just as poetry. And I think it's true. I think that we don't know going into a year if we're going to live or die. And 3 years ago, this just took on a completely new meaning to sit and read the word plague. And so I don't know if I believe in a God who is sitting inscribing this at the beginning of the
That's
year.
a problem, isn't it?
But everything else reads pretty true and pretty accurate. That's reflecting back on the past year. None of us knew which one of these things were going to come true. And that given that the only thing we can do.
Which is the position we just heard, yeah.
Right. And that the only thing we can do is the next line, right? The next three things aren't
Right.
God
So
things.
we
They're
should
just,
get there.
they're
then.
just us.
So let's get there. But the problem is how you pass over the notion of a God who determines it. And so let us say, God forbid, I had lost somebody. Well, I did actually. My wife died this year. Now, so do I say, well, you know, it was decided last Yom Kippur. I mean, you know, it's still a mystery, and I don't know why it happened, but God sat there and said, okay, your time is up. I find that very difficult, all the more so if, God forbid, you lose a child, or people who got sick with COVID. If God decides you're going to get it, you're not going to get it, you can wait until we have the vaccination. You can't. So that's the issue that sticks in your craw. And unless you're prepared to live with the symbolic view of it, but we'll get there. I'm going to move on just because I want to make sure that maybe we'll have a chance later on, okay? But I want to make sure this moves because we've got a long way to go still. And I know we have an hour and a half only. So we're up to the line 26, which is what you said. We got to move on to that right away. But repentance, prayer, and charity mitigate the hardship of the decree. You don't like that? Microphone.
I like your translation.
Okay, I'm glad for that. I'll take it.
Okay, so
You mean it's right?
because
No, I'm only joking.
well, ma'avirin does not necessarily mean mitigate,
What do you think it means?
overturn.
Oh, you think it's overturned?
Avor, to pass over. Ma'avirin,
That's interesting.
mitigate more means like soften, I think, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
right.
I've never read. You are so much more than this. I've never read the Hebrew that way, and I've seen the translations try and soften the Hebrew, and it's always bothered me.
So the translation I was using was Joel's, my son's,
Okay.
but he actually translated it literally, causes the decree to pass. Now that means it passes us by. And I read that as to mitigate. In other words, here I am suffering, but it's gone. It doesn't last forever. Certainly, I think what they're talking about here is that I think they're talking about they can't overturn it. I don't think, but we can discuss it. I'm not sure. Either way, how you read it matters everything. And I don't know that you're wrong. I'm willing to learn from you, and I think it might be right. You're a Hebraist after all. It might say, it depends what prayer book. We used to say it
Averts the severe decree.
yeah, is that right? Well, soften means exactly passes by. You live through it, but you live through it. I don't think it means overturn, but it might. I can see what Danny's driving at. So it could go either way. All right, we'll leave it at it could be either way. Anyway, 28, your glory is like your name. This seems like an afterthought, but it's not. Your glory is like your name. Slow to anger, quick to forgive. You do not want the dead to die, but for them to turn from their path and live. It shouldn't be the dead to die. I should have, once they're dead, of course they'll die. You don't want people to die, you mean? Okay, that's my mistake. You wait until the day they die, accepting them immediately if they return. Truly, you are their creation and you know their nature, for they are flesh and blood. Their origin is dust and their end is dust. You like that? No. You don't like it?
I like it a lot. You do not want the dead to die.
Okay.
God doesn't want us to die.
Okay. At great peril, but of course the rest of the poem denies that, but you don't have the rest of the poem, exactly. Anyway, at great peril they gather food. They are like battered pottery, like withered grass, like a faded blossom, like a passing shadow, like a vanishing cloud, like blowing wind, like blowing dust, like a dream that will fly away. People usually like that. How many people like that? Put your hand up high, let's see. Danny likes it. I like it too. It's beautiful poetry. That's right. Exactly.
Hebrew says it in 3 words.
Yeah, well, a poem, it's not as poetic in translation. It loses something in translation. Now, but you are king, the living everlasting God. Your years are boundless and the length of your days endless. Your glorious chariots are priceless and the eternity of your name is limitless. One big hand up. 2. This is a rabbi's prayer, apparently. Right. Okay. Your name suits you and you suit your name. You have bestowed your name on us. So let's come back to it. But act for the sake of your name and sanctify your name to those who declare the sanctity of your name for the glory of your honored and sanctified name. It's a big deal, God's name. And then, like the utterances of the assembly, we're going to say holy, holy, holy. And so we're back into the Amidah. So, Danny, why do you like it so much?
I Shmeinu Karata Bashmecha.
You called your name by us.
I like the sense of I'm sorry. I like the sense of these lines here. The poet is struggling to connect our finitude, our names to God's name, that no matter what, our sanctity is remembered by God, our sanctity is loved by God eternally, and that Shmeinu, every time God's name is called, anytime any person's prayer, everybody that's ever lived in human history is somehow there. I just
Wow.
I find the poet
Lovely.
yeah.
Did you hand up Stephanie? I think big time. Yeah, you got a microphone too.
I think it all connects, but I was reflecting on Tshuva, Tefillah, Tzedakah, repentance, prayer, and charity. The severe decree is not that one of these things might happen in any year. The severe decree is that we're going to die. That's it. It is that we are mortal. So what do? We only have 3 real tools at our disposal for that, is that we can continue to try to we could look at everything, look at that list and be like, okay, none of this matters. I'm going to die. So what's the point? And then we say, no, one, we're actually connected to this eternity, and that's God. But then also we can make higher purpose in our life by doing tshuva, by doing tefillah, by doing tzedakah. And it doesn't overturn the severe decree, but it certainly makes life worth living. That's the softening. It's like it gives us some reason to want to be better, to want to exist in this system at all, when it could be easy to look at life and say, to be nihilist.
You like them up, Stephanie? All right. How many go back to the name? Did somebody want to add something about God's name? Yeah. Wait. Run. Microphone. Remember what you were going to say. Go ahead.
Who will live and who will die alike, because it's fate. It's happened. It's fact. And then I can like this for the sake of your name. In other words, we're all people and we're going to go through the people stuff. By bringing God in this, we have something else to bring to our, to our everyday life, to a Jewish humanity, if you like, or
Nice.
Jewish.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. Let's pass the microphone around while we have it here.
I think the emphasis on God's name has to do with the mitigation more than the individual prayer repentance. There's the existence of God, and that's what mitigates it.
Huh. Okay. Anyone else? Oh, good. Look at, I've learned how to pass the microphone.
High
Yeah.
tech.
High tech. For me, it's high tech, believe me.
So I'm curious whether it's significant to you that the paragraph of it will be written, et cetera, how many will pass it on and on, that's all in the passive voice. It seems like, at least in the English,
Passive
in
voice is
distance,
who shall live and who shall die?
it will be written. Not you will write, not God will write. It will be written. It
Yeah.
has a passive sound, at least in the English. And
Yes.
then later, especially in addressing God's name,
passive
it's
in the
very
Hebrew too.
right. It's very immediate. It's calling on God's name as if almost as a counterpoint
That's
to
nice.
this.
I didn't realize that. That's very nice. Okay. Okay, you're better at it than I am. You get to talk too if you want. Okay, anyone else? Okay, over to Jesse and then we'll move along. It's a rabbi's comment, yeah.
I also
Well-
like that it's just such this existential angst here to try and figure out who is this God I believe in. And the metaphor of a shepherd is so beautiful of a shepherd caring individually for each and every
Yeah.
sheep, but then you have to reckon with what you said. Well, like, okay, what about the sheep that die? And in the end, we're not left with a metaphor in the end. In the end, we're just left with God's name, as if to say, any human metaphor that we try and understand God with, there's going to be it's completely imperfect. And so we're just left with a 4-letter name that we don't even know how to pronounce.
Yeah, that's right. Good. All right, we're going to come back to some of your points about God's name and about the power of the positive, possibly the active voice. It's a nice idea. But before we do that, let's figure out how the prayer came into being. And there we have a story. So ignore for the time being page 18 and jump to page 19. And never mind lines 11 to 13, which we'll understand in a minute. We'll get back to them. I will introduce the story by my rabbi in my little town of Kitchener. Every year, Yom Kippur, I was 8, I was 9, I was 10, whatever. He would interrupt the prayers at this point, and he would say to us something like, "We are at the most formal," he didn't say dismal, "prayer in the prayer book, the most significant prayer of all the high holy days." Now, he didn't sound quite that. He wasn't a pompous man at all, but for a 10-year-old, he's up there, the rabbi. It sounded to me like everything he said is right. So then he said, this prayer was written by a man in the Middle Ages who were tortured to death. And then he proceeded to tell us all about torture. Yes. Nowadays, we'd sue him or something like that, trigger warning, But in those days, we didn't know from that. So I have translated the story that he told us about. So what we're now going to read is a story from the Middle Ages that tells you how it happened. So here's how the prayer got started according to the story. But I, of course, give you a trigger warning. There is torture in here. Here we go. The story of Rabbi Amnon of Mainz, great in his generation, wealthy, of fine lineage, handsome and good looking. Remind me to come back to that, okay? The nobles and the bishop, now it's not quite clear, they talk about plural nobles and singular bishop, but at times they blur the two. So sometimes they say the noble said, but it sounds like they mean the bishop said. So they mix a little bit the cast of characters, you'll see. The nobles and bishop began asking him to apostatize to their mistaken way, and he refused to listen to them. But it happened that while they were talking to him one day, and he was refusing to listen, the noble, probably the bishop, badgered him until he replied, "I want to think the matter through for 3 days." He said this just to put them off. But at the minute he took leave of the noble, what he had said sunk in. How an expression of doubt had left his lips, as if there were any possibility that any sort of advice or process would lead him to deny the living God. He went home unable to eat or drink. His relatives and friends came to console him, but he refused consolation, saying, "Because of what I said, I will go to my grave in grief." On the 3rd day, still pained and anxious, the noble sent for him, and he replied, "I won't go." When the evil one sent princes more numerous and honored than the first, he still refused to go. Ordered that Amnon be quickly brought against his will, and they speedily brought him. He asked, "What's this, Amnon? Why didn't you come to me as you stipulated? Having thought it over, why didn't you return word to me as I expected you to?" Amnon replied, "Let me adjudicate my own case. The tongue that lied to you deserves to be cut off. Amnon wanted to sanctify the name of God because he had spoken as he did. Remind me to come back to sanctify the name of God if I don't. No, the bishop responded, not your tongue will I cut off. It spoke well, but your feet, that you did not come when you promised, and I will torture the rest of your body. Thus did the evil one command, and they hacked off its fingers and toes, bit by bit. I knew that already from my rabbi. At each joint, they would ask him, Amnon, now do you want to convert to our faith? And he would say, no. When they finished hacking, the evil one commanded that Rabbi laid on a shield the pieces of his extremities beside him and be sent home. That is why his name is Amnon, because He'emin, he had faith. Can you see the root of Amnon, He'emin? Can you see the sound? Vowels change in Hebrew depending on if it's a noun, a verb, and so on. But it's the same Menun, He'emin. It's the same word. So they're explaining his name. He was called Amnon because He'emin, he had faith in the living God and suffered horrendous torture out of love, just on account of something he had said. Sometime later, the time rolled around for Rosh Hashanah to arrive, and he asked his relatives to take him to the synagogue, along with all the finger and toe joints which had been salted, and to lay him next to the prayer leader. They did so, and when the prayer leader got to a particular part in the Kedusha, Rabbi Amnon said, wait a minute, will I sanctify the name of God? In a loud voice, he then responded, therefore let holiness rise up to you. That's the first line, right, of this prayer. Remember that? As if to say, I have sanctified your name with regard to your sovereignty and your unity. Then he recited Unatana Tokef Kedushat Hayom. That's the first line of the poem next. And he said, truly you are judge and prosecutor. We read that part, right? In order to accept the verdict of his fingers and toes being removed, and so on and so on. Then he mentioned everyone's signature is in it, since that was the fate he chose for him on Rosh Hashanah. When he had completed the Siluk, remember that's the name of the poem he was speaking, ninth part, he was taken up. Can you see the play on words there? Salak, nistalek, the Siluk, both. There's a play on words here with the verb to go up, to ascend, and the name of the prayer, which is Siluk. He was taken up, and in the sight of all present, he disappeared from the world and was no more. Of him it is said, how much goodness you have stored up for those who love you. Because of the truthful words that Amnon had offered up, he was invited into the yeshiva on high. On the third day after he was ritually washed and purified, he appeared in a night vision to our Rabbi Kalonimus, son of Rabbi Meshulam, son of Rabbi Kalonimus, son of Rabbi Moshe, son of Rabbi Kalonimus, and taught him that very poem, Unatana Tokef, and bade him distribute it throughout the far reaches of exile. Might be a witness and a memorial to him, and the Gaon, that is the rabbi in question, did so. Well, that's quite a story, right? Not be surprised, however, to find out not a word of it is true. There was no Rabbi Amnon of Mainz. Or if there was, we don't know about it. That's pretty hard to believe that he went through all of this and was so famous, no one else talks about him. Doesn't anyone say, oh, he was my rabbi, I remember, he bar mitzvahed me or something, right? Nobody mentions him. So probably he didn't exist. And then there are a couple of suspicious things. You see, remember Amnon comes from the root have faith, right? This is Rabbi Faithful. Who names their kid Faithful? Who just happens to turn out to be a rabbi and is faithful at the right time. Look at that, he's got the right name, go figure. And then how he dies. He dies by going up, just like his poem goes up to God. And so it's like he takes his poem with him. I mean, it's a great story. It's written with brilliance. If you knew all the references, you'd see more about how this is an incredible story. I mean, if it were a short story, You'd say, wow, who wrote this thing? This is really great. Go back to the handsome and good looking on line 16. That's a quotation from the from the story of Joseph. Why? What do you remember about Joseph? Tell me something about Joseph. Who was Joseph? Went to Egypt. What did he do when he was in Egypt? Worked for the Pharaoh, did all the great stuff. Exactly. Before he got to the work for the Pharaoh, what happened to him? Yeah, he was. Yeah, then you're right. He worked for. Yes, you got it. She found his way to Potiphar's home, and Mrs. Potiphar fell for him. I mean, we don't know what her husband looked like, but he was very good looking, and he was around all the time. And so she decided to seduce him, but he did not get seduced. She got angry, and so she sends him off to jail, where he tells about the dreams. That's the right word. Thank you. He explains the dreams of some other people who had been sent to jail, and one thing leads to the other, and he gets to Pharaoh and he tells his dreams and so on. It's a great story. Now, the rabbis love the story of Mrs. Potiphar, and they've got one story after another about how he managed somehow to not to be seduced. Perhaps the most famous one is he wouldn't look at her. I mean, that helps. So what did she do? She took a pitchfork, stuck it under here, and he couldn't look down. He was forced to look her right in the face. But he managed not to be seduced. You know how? The image of his deceased father came up in his mind, and he paid attention to his father's visage, who would have said to him, "Don't fall for it." Rabbis love that. And they call him not just Joseph, but Joseph the Tzaddik, the righteous. Now, he doesn't fall for her seduction. And what about our guy here? Same thing. He doesn't fall for the seduction of power and of the princes. Right away, we told at the beginning, this is going to work out well. You'll see. Because he's not going to do it. He won't fall for this. He will not become Christian. He will stay loyally Jewish no matter what. Well, what about the people at the end? Rabbi Kalonymus. Any of you raised with a Rabbi Kalonymus? You remember, I haven't been on a search committee for rabbi ever, and you said, I don't know about this Kalonymus guy. It probably didn't happen. Not our favorite rabbi's name, but actually the German Jewish community, which this represents, had been founded by Italians. In the 10th century, Jews were in Italy, and they began crossing the Alps, and they set up a magnificent Jewish community in the Rhineland. The Rhineland turns out to be where Amnon of Mainz is located. Mainz is in the Rhineland, right? So when they say that he told the story, remember he recites the poem and he gives it to the Rabbi Kalonymus to pass on, and the rabbi did. That's like saying he didn't give it to any old rabbi. You know, even Rabbi Zemel he didn't give it to. He chose the founding rabbi of all of the Rhineland. He gave it then to the person who was descended from a founder, and therefore it became a founding poem. And it's a way of saying this is critical to who we are of our German Jewish identity. And apparently it worked because everyone says the poem, right? Now, as I say, he never existed. So we'd like to know where the story comes from. We get the story from, now turn back to page 18. This is a dramatis personae or something like that. So I already mentioned, by the way, Yanai was a synagogue poet. We come back to him. We're going to look up another guy called Romanos. But our story picks up actually with Rabbi Ephraim of Bonn and another guy named Rabbi Isaac Orzarua of Vienna. Orzarua was his book. So they call him by his book's name. It would be really good if people did that because you wouldn't have to remember the author. You know how I can't remember who wrote it. If you wrote, you know, you'd say, oh yes. They often put the names of their books into their full name. So Rabbi Isaac Or Zarua lives, you see, from 1200 to 1270. And we read the story in Rabbi Isaac Or Zarua's book. He's the one who tells us this, he's the one who tells us about the story, and he says he got it from Ephraim of Bon. So let's look at the context, what's going on in that period of time. We start with 1095. The first crusade breaks out. The crusaders come in waves. The first wave of the crusaders is the popular crusade, not the one organized by the powers that be. These popular crusaders, they head down and kill all the Muslims. It's great. They'll take over the promised land. They get as far as the Rhineland. They have no map. They don't have a GPS. No phone. They can't say how long it'll take to get there. And when they get as far as the Rhineland, it's like your kid in the back of the car. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? The answer is no, not yet. So they stop in the Rhineland. When can we start killing people? They start falling. Can't kill Muslims, they'll kill Jews. And so the Jews are decimated. This was to German Jewry like our Shoah. We know how Jews lived in Germany all that period of time. And how could it happen in Germany of all places, right? Well, for them, the same thing. They had lived 100 years, a wonderful Jewish community, yeshivas, synagogues, great rabbis. And all of a sudden, in an instant, that's gone. They've been wiped out by these crusaders who have come from France. That leaves its mark on the Jewish psyche for the rest of time. And in fact, many of our parts of our prayer books come from that. There are several places, especially the most important one, Yisker. When the people died, they picked up the corpses, they buried them, and they kept a book called a memory book of the names of the people who had died. And they put in the first line of it, Yizkor Elohim, may God remember, and then they listed the names. Centuries go by, other communities lose the names, but they remember the idea. And they start saying of themselves, of the people they love, Yizkor Elohim, may God remember. And then they start adding their own names, and now we have an entire service based on that. So our Yizkor service goes all the way back to that, originally to those martyrs. They were martyrs for sure. Well, in 1099, the First Crusade gets as far as Jerusalem. And they established the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, Christian kingdom. It's going to last almost 100 years. 1144, there's a Muslim counteroffensive in Asia Minor. Hearing about it, a second crusade is proclaimed. In 1146, the second crusade again, carnage in Rhineland Jewry, a second time. Not as bad as the first, but there weren't as many Jews to kill. But nonetheless, carnage once again. Now, Rabbi Ephraim of Bon, remember, in 1177, he writes something called the Book of Memory, and he memorialized the Rhineland Jews and tales of their martyrdom. Here's what he says. The slaughter was so great that the day after, the bishop ordered the remains of all the slaughtered saints to be loaded on, meaning Jews who died, he loaded onto wagons, along with all their severed limbs, hips, shoulders, fingers, and toes, so they could be buried. Here, in this story, of course, the bishop is giving them a burial at least, right? But you can hear about their severed toes and so on and so forth, right? In 1187, Saladin the Great destroys the Latin kingdom. And in 1260, Isaac ben Moses of Vienna writes Or Zarua, and he gives us a story. And he says, got this story about Rabbi Amnon from Ephraim of Bon. So here's what we think happened. Rabbi Ephraim of Bon knew the story about the first group of martyrs. And he watched the second crusade, probably in his youth. In any case, 1277, he knows all these stories. And he knows the story, especially about what happened in the Second Crusade. And he was hearing rumors. There were rumors already that another crusade might occur. And he was petrified that it would happen. And he knew that in this case, Jews would be killed no matter what. And the question is, would they be faithful to God or wouldn't they? And if they're going to, after all, die, for what end? Surely there must be some end to it, some purpose. So he invents this notion, it was around already, it had been applied to the martyrs, that they die for God's sake. It's called Al Kiddush Hashem, for the sanctification of God's name. So to die as a martyr is not to die in vain. That's his story. His story is, you can be like Rabbi Faithful. You can be faithful. Stick it out. Be like Joseph. Don't give in. Don't convert. Even if you die, at least you'll know you died for a purpose. So he writes this story to give meaning and purpose to the deaths that have occurred and that are going to, he think, occur again at the end of the century. The story catches on, obviously. And eventually, this Rabbi Or Zarua reports on it. And ever since then, it became a tale that was taken to be true. What we still don't know yet, however, is who wrote the poem. And in fact, we now know, because we have the manuscript of it, one manuscript of it, which we dug up in Israel. All those poems that are in our prayer book, they are just a small tip of the iceberg compared to the total number of poems. You can't imagine the creativity that had taken place in an earlier period of time, the 4th, the 5th, the 6th century. We wrote many, many, many such poems. Now, I have here the name of Yanai. Remember that? You can look at the first cast of characters. It turns out we've discovered the poem and Yanai wrote it. It's got nothing to do with martyrs. Yanai wrote it as a poem in the 4th, 5th century. And we even know that the genre of poem was commonplace because we have a similar poem by a man named Romanos, who was a Christian living in the Byzantine world. The Byzantine world is that period of time when the Western Roman Empire has fallen and the Roman Empire is now operated out of Constantinople. And the churches that are growing leaps and bounds because Constantine had become Christian. And they're building churches over every temple. They're using mosaics. Have you seen those churches? Anyone been to Constantinople, to Ravenna in Italy, seen those churches? I mean, picture, the best one in America is in St. Louis, where you can go into and you can see the whole wall, the ceiling, it's all entirely mosaics. Mosaics are tiny little pieces of stone by themselves, nothing, but you put them all together, gorgeous. The poets decided they would do with words what the builders were doing with stone. They would take a word from here and a word from there and a word from somewhere else, and they would string together words and they would make these poems. The most famous one is a man named Elazar Kalir, who lived just after Yanai. Kalir, for example, I'll give you an example. Kalir wrote one of these long poems for every single passage of every single parsha, Sedra, in Torah. And they is in Eretz Israel, which was what was represented in Byzantium, right? Not Babylonia. They actually had a triennial cycle. So you had to write one for 3 years of readings. Imagine that. I mean, this guy wrote amazing stuff. Now, he writes one for Parashat Noah, the story of Noah, right? And he wants to talk about the rainbow. And he wants to say, God designated a rainbow, but there's no Hebrew word for designate yet. But he knows the rainbow is called a sign, an oat. So he takes the word oat and he makes it into a verb. The verb is going to be la'atate for various grammatical reasons. And so to designate is la'atate. Good luck if you know that. There's no pointing, so you just have to figure it out. Then because he wants an acrostic, he takes the first word, which is an aleph from atate. That's an aleph with an a under it. And he puts that as his first word and he drops the lamed. Because after all, it doesn't work with the lamed. Now you pick up his poem and the first 3 letters make no sense at all. How are you supposed to know what it means? This one little stone with many other stones. And you work with it, you play with it. We don't know how they understood that stuff. We have no idea. We understand it because there's apparatus at the bottom of the page. Scholars have figured it out. We really don't know. Were they that smart? They knew everything back then? Was it just the music? That's a possibility. We don't know. But I just want you to see the enormous creativity of that period of time and see that our poem is a Jewish part of enormous creativity in a period of Jewish freedom. I want you to see the difference too between our poem and Romanos. Romanos wrote the same kind of poem, but he wrote it about the end of time, when finally Jesus comes a second time, and now you're going to be sent to heaven or hell. And this is the great day of the Lord. God's going to decide who goes one way, who goes the other way. Romanos knows nothing about penitence, prayer, and charity. Because for him, it's all over. That's it. You had your chance. Our poet says, not exactly. He wants it to be for Yom Kippur, when we think about our death. And he wants to write a poem to help us think about it. And he wants to say it's not all over. Penitence, prayer, and charity can help. For all the reasons that you've mentioned. I love the story of this poem because it teaches us three things, at least three things, right? The first thing, I think, is it teaches us, hold on a minute, I want to point something out here, and you'll put it somewhere. Okay. Yeah. The first thing that it does, it teaches us, I think, what happens in a time of freedom, as opposed to what happens in a time of misery. Piety of Penitence taught that only if you're penitent and miserable can Jewish creativity take place. In fact, just the opposite is the case. In fact, the greatest poetry of the Jewish people happened in a time when we were free to create. Other poems followed. Many of them, in fact, were in the time of the Spanish Golden Age. There too, what you see is great creativity. Not because we were being persecuted. We weren't. We were doing pretty well, actually. We were doing just fine. And that's why we were able to create. So my point with you then is that's the way we are now, aren't we? There's never been a community like ours. I mean, I know there's more anti-Semitism. You're going to remind me. I know it. But in the grand scheme of things, we were talking about that this morning. In the grand scheme of things, we're doing pretty well. I don't think there's ever been a Jewish community with as much money, as much learning, as much free time, as much creativity as now. My God, what we can create. One of the things we do when we go to synagogue on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, is say we want to dedicate ourselves to great American Judaism. I am talking your language. I mean, that has been Danny Zemmel's call to you from the beginning. No one has emphasized that of all the rabbis I know the way Rabbi Zemmel has. And I just want to affirm that with a strong exclamation mark. My God, what we can do. So let us, as I say, discover a new kind of piety, right? It's a piety of a higher purpose. And let us explore the higher purpose in poetic ways so that we can leave to our posterity yet another golden age. We have not yet done it, but it is doable if we want it to happen. Second lesson has to do with how you read poems like this, and you've already anticipated it. You've talked about the symbolism of it. You've talked about you like the way it sounds. You've talked about, yeah, we'll forget this part, but there's that part, and so on. Much of it literal you don't believe. So the question is, how do you read liturgy when you're praying when you don't believe it? Because this is not the only prayer. If I was thinking of doing it, but I knew we didn't have the time. But next time you go to synagogue, like later we have a service, You tell me how many lines you really believe. Mostly we don't believe any of it, not literally. And yet somehow we think we should. Because if it's not literally true, then is it true? And I want to say there are other kinds of truths. So think of a novel. You've just read a great novel, you know, and everyone you see, I say, Beth, you got to read this novel. I mean, it's a great, great novel. You got to read it. You didn't expect to say, yeah, but it's not true. My answer is, what do you mean it's not true? It's better than true. It's deeper truth. I mean, why should you bother going to an art gallery? Doesn't have any truths, right? Opera. How many people go to the opera? How many people go to the opera because they think the stories are true? Good grief, the stories are the stupidest thing you ever came up with. Only an idiot would think any of that is true. You can't even follow it. But you know there's a truth to it. But somehow or other at the end, you find yourself crying. I do anyway. You know, I know that Shakespeare isn't true, but somehow when I watch King Lear, you know, which I don't go to King Lear if I can avoid it. I find it too hard. The truths are too hard to take. The real truths of life then are known through poetry. They're known through literature. They're known through art. Art then gives you a deeper truth. But guess what? You have to suspend your disbelief. That's my second lesson then. You need to suspend your disbelief. You have to enter prayer with the sense that it's a novel. It is a great work of art. Better, it's an opera because there's music all over the place. There's music and there's action and everyone takes a part. It's not the kind of art that you just sit and watch. You're part of it. It's your story. This is the grand drama of the Jewish people. And you enter into it as one of the Jewish people. And you say, this is my story. If you enter into it that way, you don't really care whether one line is true or not. And you already were doing that when we had the conversation. Because every time I tried to say you like it, you say, yeah, I do. I don't believe it, but I like it. And you were on to exactly what we have to do. And that's true with the rest of everything we do in the synagogue service. Prayer makes sense only if you see it as art, as literature, as poetry that evokes what's true about the human condition and leads us to the possibility of something beyond, something we dare call God. That perhaps there is a soul. Perhaps there is an afterlife. Who knows? Don't tell me you don't believe it because science doesn't believe it. The question is, yeah, that's neither here nor there. Is there something that points to truth? I call it expressing the truth. Somehow art expresses things rather than just stating them in simple declarative sentences. So to conclude, I want to do something that I have already done with you in short. It's a long time ago. The whole service of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur has to be looked at as art and as grand truths. What if you suspend your disbelief? What if you enter into the story? Now, when you enter into a story, you have to study it. Sometimes you see the symbolic value of it. You see the background, you didn't know that before. Your imagination allows you to see things you wouldn't have seen. Like, oh yeah, Joseph, I get it. He was Joseph. I know what's going to happen here. This is called dramatic foreshadowing, right? That's true throughout the service. So now let me look at you with Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur as a piece of art. Rosh Hashanah to start with. Rosh Hashanah features the blowing of the shofar. A student came to me one day and she said, I've discovered in the Talmud that the shofar is likened, the sound of the shofar is likened to a woman in labor. So I looked it up, sure enough. She wrote a thesis on it. And she said, this is, she said, all about women, this service. And indeed it is. It's all about giving birth or not. What do we read in the Torah on Rosh Hashanah? Yeah, I know, you say the Akedah, the crying, the Isaac being bound by Abraham. That's the Reform Jews maybe read it on day one because they only have a day one. But originally, day one was the chapter before. which is all about God visits Sarah to tell her that she will give birth. The reason we read the crying of Isaac is it's the next chapter. There's nothing deep about it. They had one Torah. The Torah was open. Instead of finding something else, said, this is okay. We'll read that one next. But then that one took over our imagination. But the real story is the story about God tells Sarah that she will give birth. We call this the birthday of the world, don't we? Every time the shofar blows, as soon as it blows, we say, this is the birthday of the world. So the world just was birthed. This is a feminist image, friends. How was the world created? The answer is the world was birthed. Here is a woman who's birthing the world. Throughout the service, there are these symbols. The last shofar blast is the Shokia Gadola, the great big long one. And the rabbis say that's the final cry as the child is born. So you hear that at the end, and you know now the world can be reborn. And that's what we're supposed to walk away with. Possibilities of the world, positive view in the world, how rebirth is really possible. The miracle's possible. Remember Sarah? These things can happen. And the world doesn't have to be the way it is. Be reborn for good things. And you walk away and you have a sense that this is really a new year, a new birth. Now, if Rosh Hashanah is about your birth, it won't surprise you to realize that Yom Kippur is your death. So think of it. There's some customs. Once again, this was done by a student. There are some customs. Eleanor Smith came up with this. There are some customs beforehand. There's a custom of visiting the cemetery. Do you visit the cemetery, the grave? There you go. No, you don't. But you could. At any rate, it turns out that in tradition, you didn't just visit, but you gave a prayer to your deceased. And the prayer basically says, maybe you'll intercede with me tomorrow on Yom Kippur, because gee whiz, I'm not sure I was good enough even for God to listen to me. When my father died, my rabbi in Kitchener, remember, I already cited him, I loved him dearly. He said to me, my father died young, I was only in the Riddick school. And he said to me, your father will be, and he said some Yiddish, which I didn't get. Eventually, I figured out what he said. He said, your father was a good man, good enough that he will intercede for you on high. There was the assumption that when we die, we go to the better place and we can intercede with God because we're sort of like the angels. So when you visit the graveside, you're supposed to say, listen, Mom, Dad, I need you. Then people went home. On the way home, they went, however, to the mikveh. And they did this ritual washing. As you know, that's what happens to your body when you die. So you prepare yourself for death. Then they bless their children at dinner. But it's a special blessing in which it's like saying goodbye to them. It's like, hey, remember this, don't do that, please, in my future. It's not just, you know, good luck. It's a big blessing. It's like, this could be the last time. And you imagine, maybe this will be my death. Maybe this is the end. What if I have sinned too much, you say to yourself. And traditionally, what do you dress in? White, shrouds. Traditionally, you dress in shrouds. And so now, you go to synagogue in shrouds, and you ignore your body. Your body's dead. No eating, no drinking, no sex. No cleaning. You're not allowed to wash yourself in tradition because there's no body left anymore. You're done. You got washed before traditionally before in the mikveh. That's all. Then you died. And here you are in shrouds. And you practice all day being dead. And you say the confession over and over and over. A confession is what you do on your deathbed. The entire day is practicing being dead. The height of the poetry comes on Yom Kippur. at the evening before, which we call Kol Nidre service. You studied Kol Nidre with me earlier. We talked about a legal document and so on, and we said we don't believe in it, and we know it's not supposed to do it, and we do it anyway. Clearly, this is something we don't believe in. Rabbis wouldn't want to do it. They ignored the rabbis. It became symbolic. So what happens? You're standing in front of the ark. The ark in Hebrew is Aron Kodesh. It has to be Kodesh. You're not allowed to say just Aron. Traditionally, you have to call it Aron Kodesh, a holy ark. It's holy because what's in it? Torah scrolls. At Kol Nidre, you take the Torah scrolls out and you leave the ark open. And throughout this service, you're looking at the holy ark, but without the word holy, it's just an aron. That is the word for casket. You were looking into your casket, friends. You'll never stand on Yom Kippur again once you know this. That's the whole idea. You're dressed in shrouds. You don't know how much you've sinned. You have to play the game. Suspend your disbelief. What if? But I better come to terms with life. This is the day I got to come to terms with life because I'm like dead. And the only way you can do it is you know how it works out in the end. Otherwise, I don't know how you can handle it. In the end, though, you know the ark will be open one more time. That service called Meilah, my favorite service, incidentally. At Meilah, we open the ark wide. You know how you do it because you actually have people come up and pray in front of the open ark. I know that. But before we even started doing that, the ark is open and you don't always stand. Some people do, some don't. But the amazing thing is you stare at the ark and guess what? Torah scrolls are back. It's not your graves anymore. Oh, and those shrouds, we don't wear shrouds, we wear talit. You don't wear a talit traditionally at Ne'ilah. You get rid of it. Like you can get rid of your shrouds now. The day's worked out all right. And you're watching the ark and things are all right. You've come to terms with life and death and things will be okay. The covenant's back on. Torah scrolls are back. And it's a different sound. The Kaddish has a special melody. Everything's different about this service, including the confessions. By the time you get to Ne'ilah, you're tired of confessing already. Remember the two confessions we looked at, the short one, the long one? There's always a short one, then a long one. Always the Al-Chet after Ashamnu. Except at Ne'ilah. You will read Ashamnu, and when you get to the last word, you'll turn the page, and there's no Al-Chet. You're spared 3 pages of that long confession. It's like, all right, you did it enough already. And instead, you're going to get the most beautiful prayer in the world. You'll get a prayer that says, Ata notein yad, you, God, reach out your hand to sinners. If sinners, then especially then us too. And now our sins have been forgiven. And it's like God reaches out to you. I love that image. The idea is when you leave the story, because you've entered into it, and it's your story, and you get to that final moment of Ne'ilah, you go back into the world, and you may say, yeah, but still my problems are there. And what the last prayer of that beautiful service tells you, basically the last prayer is, God will reach out to you. There is an unseen hand. And you know what? If you go into the story, you will feel it. And you will have the sense that, yeah, I can go back to life. I can begin again. And to confirm that you can begin again, what's the last sound of the service? And what does the shofar blow? Kia, rebirth. You're back to birth again. I know of no other liturgy that can do this. The notion of, yes, birth to death, and you have 10 days in between to think about your life, analyze your life. Think about what if you did die? Who knows? What do you still want to accomplish? Are you wasting your life? What should you do just in case? What do you want to do when you get reborn? Because you know how it's going to end. And so I wish you therefore a Rosh Hashanah, a Yom Kippur, a suspension of disbelief, entering into the story of the Jewish people, the grandest drama that there is, and recognizing that it's all about you, us, our lives individually and communally, and the grand possibilities, which of course is where I began, with the piety of higher purpose. You can leave Yom Kippur convinced of the piety of higher purpose and know that our lives are worthwhile because we will dedicate ourselves to it.